Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jane Harmon, and I'm the person keeping you from listening to a manel. But this is also a topic I care intensely about, and I love everyone on this manel. So let me just start with, when I first came to Munich 22 years ago, 22 years and counting, I was the newly minted ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, which Mike Turner now chairs. My congressional district made most of our intelligence satellites, and I called it the Aerospace Center of the Universe. After two massive intelligence failures in the U.S., 9/11 and the faulty estimates of WMD in Iraq, I co-led the effort to establish a Director of National Intelligence and reform an intelligence business model that had existed since 1947 in the National Security Act. No doubt, this panel agrees with me that intelligence is the tip of the spear. It is a set of predictions, not policy. And if it is accurate and used adroitly, think Ukraine, the topic of this panel, it can drive good policy and also generate support for good policy. Of course, issues remain, and I just want to mention a couple and ask a question, which is apparently my role here, and I'll do it fast because it's a short panel. Here are some of the issues. How technology affects operational security. You need to know that Russian forces in Ukraine have now forbidden the use of smartphones because they emit signals. The epidemic of surveillance by nation states over their own people, think China, and over other nations. And also think balloons, oh, by the way. The use of cyber and AI to invent or obscure identity. Our intelligence community's been working on this. And my pet peeve, Mike Turner just heard about it again, overclassification of information. My law to require portion marking and improved training by the DNI was signed by President Obama in 2010 and never fully implemented. And finally, the politicization of the intel committees and the whole intelligence enterprise in the last administration. This is not a partisan rant, it's just an observation. I think it's accurate. And fortunately, we are witnessing a course correction by the people on this stage. So all I want to do is close with something that Dave Petraeus said a few days ago, testifying before Mike Turner. He said, quote, "None of the threats is capable of defeating the United States, not China, not Russia, not Iran, not Al-Qaeda, not ISIS. The only force that can defeat the United States is the United States itself." So I put that out there so that we can be sober-minded. And my one question, folks, which I hope Graham will ask to the group, in addition to all the brilliant questions he has, is we did something different at the beginning of the Ukraine war. We declassified intelligence, and we put it out for the whole world. My question to the panel is, why did we do that, and how effective was it? Please welcome Graham Allison, or Allison Graham, as it says in the print material.
Right. So if you need an introduction to our two distinguished guests, you came to the wrong session. And I think Jane had asked a good question to start with. And I think Director Burns has been at the center of what's been in the story of intelligence, at least as I've watched it over the decades, a fantastic advance in understanding, before many people in Russia understood what Russia was going to do, and certainly before, I mean, if you were at this time last year at Munich, Zelensky still did not believe that an invasion was impending. So the success of the intelligence community is something to be celebrated. And Jane's question, which I think is a great question, is the integration of that in diplomacy, which probably is not accidental in that one of our greatest diplomats just happens to be director of the intelligence agency. So Bill, probably you should start on that one, and then let's see what Mike says. Yeah?
Good. Yeah, I'm glad to, and it's great to be with Jane, with you, and with Congressman Turner as well, and with all of you. I think the President's decision to selectively and carefully declassify some of our secrets, some of our intelligence, has had a very important impact throughout the course of the war. It enabled us to deprive Putin of the ability to create false narratives, which in my experience with him over the years, I had seen him do all too often. Sometimes we never caught up to that as well. We could see before the war began clear evidence that Putin and the people around him were planning false flag operations to try to pin the blame for the beginning of the war on the Ukrainians falsely. And what the president was able to do was expose that fact and then expose that Putin's actions in starting the war were exactly what they were, naked and unprovoked aggression. That enabled us, I think, to help the Ukrainians anticipate what was coming, to defend themselves better, help to mobilize public opinion and underpin what became a very strong coalition. And not least, it enabled us to deprive Putin, to put him on the back foot in an information war, which was a very unaccustomed and uncomfortable position for him, since he was used to taking the initiative in these kind of circumstances. The only thing I would add is that I use the terms, carefully and selectively very deliberately, because as I've learned over many years, the surest way to lose sources of good intelligence is to be reckless in your handling of them as well. In Washington, a town, as all of us from there know, there's always a temptation to think that anything worth doing is worth overdoing. So in this case, I think, we have to be careful in case by case. But I would argue that the president's decisions in this instance had a very important impact throughout the course of the war.
Thank you. Well, I want to begin with two things. First off, to say that, like all of you, I share the fact that I adore Jane Harman. Her commitment to the Munich Security Conference and really the dialogical debate that happens here that helps formulate policy is, I think, something she shares in her heart. I also want to thank Director Burns and to just give you guys some view of the bicameral, bipartisan support that he has. If you were going to interview for someone for the CIA director and you could see into the future and you could see what they'll be challenged with, there would be no one whose resume matches the director's. But that's not the only reason he has our support. He has our support because of the trust he's earned and because he does work on a bipartisan, bicameral basis. My ranking member, Jim Himes, is here. I'm certain he would share that on our committee, both Republicans and Democrats, he has support, and we appreciate the work he's doing at such a critical time. On the issue of sharing intelligence, if you think back, it had begun to be a process, a shift in American policy before the Ukraine war. You can all think in your mind's eye of the pictures that you saw of various satellites that both China and Russia have put into space that have started the process of militarizing space. The fact that those went into space and we shared that information publicly was an effort to show what our adversaries were doing so that the public would know, so that our allies would know, but not just have nation to nation a discussion, but also worldwide call them out for what they're doing and how they're changing that environment. When the Ukraine war happened, and the director and the Biden administration saw that there was going to be this narrative and chose to put this information out, it really did change the direction of that war. And it kind of goes to something we all innately know, and that is authoritarian governments need secrecy in order to be able to exert their power. And when you expose what they are doing, you weaken authoritarian governments, and that's what we saw in their run-up to the war. As they were releasing this information, they weakened Russia's initiative.
So I add my 2 cents as a student of this for some time. So just as Jane said, intelligence is the tip of a spear. So if I know in advance what you're going to do, how am I advantaged? The answer is every way possible. I can prepare and defend myself. I can warn somebody. I can, if I want to, and in this case, announce what you're about to do, in which case there's not going to be any surprise. I can already start shaping my narrative before you get to do yours. And I think the art with which the administration has, again, selectively and carefully and without compromising sources, left Putin confused. And again, think of it, just you can think of it in your own lives and in your own business and whatever. If somebody else understands you and your system, or your committee, or your agency, or your business, or your family better than you do, and is telling you what's going to happen and what you're going to do, you're wondering, wait a minute, how have they gotten, where are they? How many places are they? So I'm waiting for the accounts of how within Putin's system, he doesn't have anybody he can trust. Because where is all this coming from? And if I were in any other country who might be an adversary of the U.S., I might also be worried. So I would say, good for the home team. Yep. Let me move us on to a second question, which I know comes from many European perspectives, having talked to folks here and listened. They sometimes find Washington politics puzzling. So I say, welcome to the club, okay? But still, watching the new Speaker of the House launch a series of investigations of President Biden and the current face-off between the President and the House, threatening even default over raising the debt ceiling, they are asking whether the sharp partisan divides, which unquestionably exist, are likely to impact the remarkable performance of the intelligence community. So that's question one. And then the second question related, the bipartisan support so far for Ukraine's war against Russia. So since you're in the midst of this, Mike, in the first instance, and you've been very clear that under your leadership, the committee's turning a new leaf. In fact, I liked one of the statements that you said that on national security, and this is consistent with your whole history as a member, I have a strong record of being able to work across the aisle and to advance what's important to the country. And as chairman, I'm going to continue in that vein. So impact on the likely performance of the intelligence community and similarly of the war in Ukraine.
Right. Well, there's a couple things. I mean, obviously, some people say democracy is messy, but I don't really see it that way. I see it more that democracy is public, right? So we don't always agree in the beginning, but that's negotiation and that's dialogue and that's debate, and that's actually what happens here at the Munich Security Conference. People voice their various opinions, you share information, people become educated of things that they perhaps did not know, and then ultimately a solution is found. And so I think that's, the process in Washington is one where you're going to see people have dialogue. They're going to have positions that are not the same. And hopefully, through the process of compromise and debate, an informed resolution will occur. That includes with the debt limit and all the other issues that are before us. Now, with respect to the Intelligence Committee, it's not just my position. With Ranking Member Himes here, we had, when we convened for our very first meeting, before the gavel came down, we were addressed, the very small committee that we are, by the Speaker of the House and the minority leader, Jeffries. So we had the lead Republican and the lead Democrat come before us and charge us with, you will work in a bipartisan way. They said that they wanted the culture that had been there before to end, and they wanted the people to work on, big surprise, national security. And everyone dedicated themselves to that. And then Jim and I addressed the committee, and we made a commitment both to each other and to the committee that we were going to do so. So I have very high confidence we're going to be able to do it, because it's not just I'm saying it, the leadership of the House is saying it, and the members of the committee are saying it. Now, how does that affect intelligence? Well, there are always going to be issues of debate and even disagreement, and we're going to find in that process either the correct answer or that one of us or the other is more right, and we'll go down that path. Now, luckily, in Congress, one thing that I think gets missed a lot of times in parliaments is our Congress really does have authority. We write every year an Intelligence Authorization Act that governs how our intelligence communities operate. And in another portion, our Appropriations Committee actually determined the budget and the spending lines, not just an aggregate amount, but the spending lines. That intervention, that ability to impact those is part of the debate where we have to have open discussion to make certain how do we best serve the intelligence community and how we make certain that the director has the most successful organization.
Oh, Bill, you've watched this over many administrations. You've watched it recently, and not just in the previous administration, but just in the last 2 years, in which the committee has had a rather different. So,
Well, I would just add a couple of things. I mean, the first is that the CIA is an apolitical institution. In my own experience, I've worked over nearly 40 years now for 6 presidents and administrations of both parties. So at CIA, we take very seriously that apolitical role, and we need to play things straight down the middle, which is exactly what we intend to do. I have great respect, I've learned this over the years, for the oversight responsibilities of the Congress. That's an important part of our democratic system as well. It sometimes means that we get asked tough questions, and that's the way the process is supposed to work. It'll make us a better agency, a better institution. But we're fortunate to work with Congressman Turner, Congressman Himes, the other members of the House committee, as well as the Senate committee, because there's a seriousness of purpose there as well. And we take that seriously as well. So, for example, it's not just in the sort of formal opportunities for hearings on the budget or anything else. I travel a lot overseas when I do, whether it's to Ukraine or someplace else. I'll always be on the phone afterwards to compare impressions and offer, whatever insights I think I've gleaned, and then to listen as well to questions and to impressions that members of our oversight committees have as well.
let me, since I know some of the members here are interested, let's go just one more level down with respect to this. So you're the director. You're appointed by the president. You're confirmed by the Senate. But in some sense, you have a chain of command, and there's a commander-in-chief. Now, but you also have a few other people to whom you have to report and who actually provide you your budget and your authorities, and even down to some level. Well, in terms of organizations and unity of command and unity of purpose, in principle on the blackboard, this looks a little confusing. So take us down a layer for both of you on just how this actually works.
Well, I can sort of give you an example of really that even though we write a bill and we do funding, which sounds more punitive than it is because it's a deliberative process where we're actually working together as a team. I can give you an issue that played out in the papers later that we worked on together as a team that affected Ukraine. Initially, the administration struggled with what were their rules of sharing of intelligence going to be with respect to Ukraine. And initially, they were way too restrictive. Our committee stepped in. We sent a bipartisan letter saying that we believed that Ukraine should know locations of Russian troops. Initially, the administration was concerned that it might be provocative, that it might result in greater conflict. But ultimately, what we saw, especially with the Russians withdrawing and the Ukrainians winning, that it was inhibiting their ability to be successful. They needed to know where the Russians were for their own defense, because that's where firepower was coming from, and that's also where they needed to be able to address the threat. That's part of the dialogue, and the intelligence community changed its rules, and it was so successful in changing the rules that it actually became public that the rule had been changed, and with great success.
That's a very good example, I think, as well, and it enabled us to, I think, provide better tactical intelligence to our Ukrainian partners as well, which had an immediate impact on the battlefield.
And we're not always going to be just the outside critic. I'm certain that in the intelligence community, they were having that same debate themselves.
Absolutely.
We just stated a position, which I think also gives them greater authority to be able to, and willingness to make a change.
But it also is complicated. So, Director Burns, give us a case in which it was more complicated than that, since that's an easy case.
Yeah, always attracted to the easier ones.
Again, something you could.
No, I mean, there's
not any secrets, but just as a picture.
No, I mean, listen, I don't think there's any contradiction between the oversight responsibilities of Congress and, what is my main responsibility, which is to support policymakers and provide the president with the very best intelligence that we can to enable good choices as well. But we also have an important responsibility to keep our oversight committees informed. A lot of that's based on trust as well, because sometimes we're sharing, very sensitive information as well. And there's lots of examples of, where we've had to do that.
I'll make an independent observation. I'm unfortunately old enough to remember when we didn't have oversight committees, or when we did, they said, don't tell us anything because we don't want to be responsible for anything. And it seemed to me it worked better, but that's just the good old days. So nonetheless, you all are making this work remarkably. The Intelligence Committee that, Mike, you've described and your proposed plans is fairly strikingly different from the way you would normally imagine what's the reality of Congress today in everything, essentially. So I see a Republican dominated House in which I think if you listen to what the Speaker says, he's quite intent on doing as much damage to Biden as he believes the Democrats did to Trump when they were in a similar position. And so I'm looking for a fairly vicious partisan struggle going forward. And I'm hoping, that would be my expectation. I'm hoping for better than that. And certainly there'll be striking exceptions, of which I'm betting in favor of the committee doing just exactly what you said. But how is the broader picture going to affect the support for the war in Ukraine?
Right. We know on both sides of the aisle, there are voices that don't fully support either the weapons that we're providing to Ukraine, the extent of the financial support for Ukraine, and or the continuation. There's been, on the Democrat side, there's been a letter that was circulated by 20 members that signed it that said to the president, bring this to an end, let's negotiate a settlement, which was withdrawn. Now, even though you withdraw it, it doesn't mean Putin didn't hear it. And you have other members who every now and then make statements that I think weaken the confidence of what Ukraine might be able to accomplish. And then, of course, on the right, there are those, a small group, just like on the left, who raise the issue of the funding and of the cause. But overwhelmingly, this is not just a majority of Congress, overwhelmingly. I mean, there are 435 of us. So if there are 35 who will question it, that means there are 400 who don't. There's overwhelming support. This is one of those issues of conscience. You know, President Zelensky has not just rallied the world because he has been successful and rallied his nation. He's also cast this in terms of, this is the fight for democracy. This is the front lines for democracy. And at the same time brought forth the information of the unbelievable atrocities. As the Vice President said earlier, the documentation of these are just really, unconscionable, unthinkable. They break all of our hearts. So with that, you're going to have overwhelming support in Congress to continue, because we have to. We have to make certain that Ukraine wins and that Russia loses, as General Petraeus just said at this conference.
Bill, you want to say anything about that?
No, I mean, the only thing I'd say on Russia and Ukraine is that I remain extremely proud of the work that CIA and the wider U.S. intelligence community has done there as well. I think collectively we were able to provide strong, accurate early warning that invasion was coming, which is the foundational responsibility of any intelligence service. I think it enabled the president to confront the Russians early on when he sent me to Moscow at the beginning of November of 21 to lay out for Putin in an unusual amount of detail what we knew about his planning and to make clear what the consequences would be. He was utterly dismissive of that at the time, and I remember coming away with the very strong feeling that here was someone who had just about made up his mind to go to war. It enabled us to help President Zelensky and our Ukrainian partners anticipate what was coming. I also went to Kyiv in January of 22, so just a few weeks before the war started, with what was then sort of our latest intelligence on the Russian plan to come south from Belarus, and as they saw it, make a lightning strike against Kyiv and seize it. It didn't work out that way, but the intelligence we provided then complemented the excellent intelligence the Ukrainians themselves already had, and I would never underestimate the quality of their intelligence services, to enable the Ukrainians to defend Gostomel Airport just northwest of Kyiv and prevent the Russians from accomplishing what they thought they could do easily. And then finally, I think that good intelligence early on in the war helped the president to cement what became an extremely strong coalition of the United States, our NATO partners, and others as well. It's a constant challenge now for us to continue to use intelligence and sharing it wisely and quickly to cement that coalition and try to keep Putin on the back foot. But that's something we're deeply committed to.
And by the way, what he just said
just one more on it. Normally, if if Party A has super intelligence on Party B and is continuing to take advantage of that, Party B begins to wonder how in the hell is this happening and looking for the clues and trying to close down what they could close down. Are you seeing any loss of your capabilities?
Not lost, but you're certainly seeing the effort that you described on the other side.
I'm sorry.
Putin probably doesn't think he has many friends because Director Burns is making certain of that.
Yeah.
So I just want to underscore what he just said, because the providing of intelligence to Ukraine and its comparison to the intelligence that they have, being able to be usable in the battlefield is probably one of the most important things that has been done here. Beyond just advanced weapon systems and unlimited inventories, it has been that precision of information.
And again, in big picture, President Putin says this is a war between Russia and, not Ukraine, but Russia and the West. And he regards our providing intelligence on the targets, which then American-supplied weapons hit, as a sign of hostility. And I would say a Martian would probably agree with them. So we don't want to describe this as anything other than a war between the U.S. and Ukraine. But if I were a Martian watching this story, I would say it looks to me like there's some other parties that are just behind the veil and whose support is critical to the performance of folks on the battlefield, and none more important than the intelligence. Yeah.
If I could comment on that, I think we're too quick to say that we're supporting the war in Ukraine. We're actually supporting Ukraine, and if there weren't Russians in Ukraine, there wouldn't be a war. So we could send weapons and we could send intelligence, but if there wasn't the aggressor there, there'd be no American weapons shot. There'd be no war.
Well, I think that's almost right. I'd say I could find some American weapons in Ukraine before the war.
But I mean, shot
okay.
weapons.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing to shoot at.
Yes.
If there were no Russians, there'd be no war.
No, certainly if there were no Russians, there'd be no war. Let me take you to the broader picture here for a minute. So another certainly competitor, potential adversary, is Xi Jinping and China. And the relationship between Xi and Putin and China and Russia has become, I think it's the most consequential non-declared alliance in the world. But if I were Xi Jinping and his team watching what's going on, I probably would be thinking, oh, wait a minute, have these Americans discovered something magical? Maybe there's a whole new version, a whole new set of sources and methods that we don't have? Or have they, how many people in China maybe, like, how many people, whatever the sources are, how much of what you're seeing in the Russian story could I find in my world? In addition, watching the poor performance of Russian military and Russian equipment on the field, especially if I bought a lot of Russian equipment, that may be another reason for me to be having some further thoughts. So how from, without telling us anything that you couldn't properly tell us, how is this being read in Beijing? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any foreign leader who's watching what's been happening in Ukraine, Putin's experience in Ukraine, more intently than Xi Jinping. I think he, early on in the war, was unsettled and certainly sobered by what he saw, not just the incompetent and very poor performance of the Russian military, which I don't think he or his intelligence services anticipated, but the way in which the Ukrainians resisted with courage and tenacity, the way in which they used asymmetrical weapons, to set back, a more powerful military in many respects. I think he was also sobered what he saw in terms of the coalition that the president built and the willingness of the coalition supporting Ukraine to absorb economic costs in the furtherance of imposing even greater economic costs on Russia. So as she looks not just at the whole international landscape, but particularly at a place like Taiwan, where I would never underestimate Xi Jinping's ambitions, I think, and a place where I think he and the PLA leadership, the Chinese military leadership, already had doubts about their ability to succeed in invading and controlling Taiwan. I think this experience has probably deepened some of those doubts as well. Doesn't mean that any of us should underestimate those ambitions at all, and we clearly see indications of Xi instructing his military to be ready later in this decade to accomplish that task. That doesn't mean that an invasion is going to occur on X date in 2027 or whenever. What it does mean, though, is that I think the risks increase the further you get into this decade and beyond, and because Xi is paying, as I said, very careful attention to what lessons he needs to draw from Putin's awful experience in Ukraine.
So how is the committee thinking about that?
Well,
So lessons that both Xi and other countries may be learning from what we're watching.
Right. I serve also on the Armed Services Committee and the Intelligence Committee, and I can tell you from a perspective of not just what is Xi thinking and what are the consequences or outcomes for Taiwan. We need to keep focused on the issue of what does it mean for all of international security when you look at China's expansion of its military capabilities. When you look at hypersonics, its expansion of its nuclear weapons program could be tripled over the next several years. Their militarization of space, what they're doing with subs and ships and all of their weapon systems to try to defeat the weapon systems of the West, in addition to the surveillance society, their use of technology to penetrate and control their own population and to propagate that into other countries. It goes well beyond just a footprint that's designed to support their invasion of Taiwan. And I think as we look at this as a committee, it's not just Taiwan is on our agenda, China's on our agenda.
No, that's absolutely right. I agree. And that's, at our agency anyway, we have no higher priority than that long-term geopolitical challenge posed by China. For all the focus on, Russia's war in Ukraine, we've continued to devote more and more resources, more and more attention to that China challenge because it is going to loom larger than any other single challenge that we face, I think, as a country and as an intelligence service.
Well, I think the president has made plain, and I think the bipartisan statements about the proposition that over the next decade, 2, 3, as far as anyone can see, the primary strategic challenge for the U.S. will be a rising China. And it's pretty hard to keep this in perspective because for all, and I think in particular, American politics tends to oversimplify things and frequently to, I'd say in the current conversation, largely demonize China. I've written about this. I believe that China has risen meteorically in a manner that makes inevitable that this be the fiercest rivalry between a rising power and a ruling power that we've ever seen. And I think that's baked into the structure of the situation. But when I hear, oh my God, China is going to triple its nuclear arsenal, and so they might have 1,000 warheads in a decade, I ask myself, how many warheads do we have? Now, I would say it's going to impact our warheads because obviously if we have to think about more targets, we need to think about whether our arsenal is adequate. But there's no natural state of the world that should say the U.S. should be a nuclear superpower and China should take a seat way down at the end of the table. If I were playing the Chinese hand, I might do the same thing. And I would say similarly, in most other domains, their behavior looks like, quote, normal, not acceptable from our point of view, but normal for a rising power to, at this stage of their rise. So the lesson I take away from this is that it's an even greater challenge than I would think otherwise, because it's baked in structurally into the situation. And I think that's why, as we watch this to go back and forth, we have to be very cautious about, or have to be keep calibrating ourselves to say what part of this is different than what we do. Again, I'm not doing moral equivalence because I believe we're the good guys and others are bad guys. So I have no moral equity with respect to this. But I do try to ask myself, what would a Martian analyst say looking at this situation?
Right. So that's certainly, I think that's good caution. But at the same time, you have to ask the question of what is the intent? China already has sufficient forces for deterrence. They already have sufficient capabilities that their mainland and that they're safe. When you start looking extraterritorially and when you start to looking to developing, for example, hypersonics that can orbit the planet, first strike capabilities, you're reaching beyond just deterrence or even a parity. You're reaching to those types of things that are truly destabilizing, and that's when you have to be concerned. What is their intention?
But again, the Martian might observe, has the U.S. ever done anything like this? And if you were given the opportunity to choose between situation one, in which I have the advantages to take actions against you that you're not able to deal with, and situation two, you have the advantages to do this, I would prefer position one rather than two. And position one has been the position that the U.S. has enjoyed for the last 70 years as the predominant military power in the world. I believe that peace through strength, which has actually been peace through American superior strength, has made it possible to create an international order that's given us 7 decades without great power war. And that's why the emergence of another great power makes this whole story more uncomfortable.
Right, because the concern is we're for democracy, they're not, and you don't want the superior weapons and superior power to be in the hands of authoritarian regimes.
I think that's a fair proposition, but in any case, the Martian would say, whether you were A or B, you would have the same preference.
Graham, your reference to Martians reminds me we need to do more work to develop our Martian sources, I guess. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But as an intelligence service, I mean, we take very seriously the importance of us digging deeper and being able to provide the president as well as oversight committees with the sense of the Chinese leadership's planning intentions and capabilities as well. There's no higher priority.
One of the great characteristics of the intelligence agency is that without being sympathetic to an adversary's views, you practice what I call strategic empathy, which is to try to get the picture as it may look in someone else's skin and through their eyes, because that's an essential part of trying to anticipate what they might do and asking how you can possibly cope with it.
As distinct from strategic sympathy, which is a much different thing, because that kind of empathy doesn't mean that you accept or indulge the perspectives of the Chinese leadership or anybody else. But smart intelligence work and ultimately smart policy does depend to some extent on understanding those perspectives.
And I just had one last thing. I can assure you I'm not going to release classified information in saying this. None of the objects shot over North America recently were Martians.
Well, here's an interesting, I think that's likely. I think it's likely, but if you listen to the National Security spokesman Kirby's statement, I think it was Wednesday or Thursday, he says, I think I can assure you with some level of confidence that none of the objects we shot down were American. Excuse me, that's last Wednesday or Thursday. And you can be sure he was saying the strongest statement he could say. So my take on this is, if you look in that space, there's a hell of a lot of stuff. Here's a takeaway for you. There's a single American agency that releases more than 1,000 balloons every week that pass through this zone. and that's called the National Weather Agency. You just go look at their annual report. 60,000 last year. So if you go up in that space, there's a lot of stuff, and I think there's probably more to this story before we're done. Bill, let me tell you, because we don't have much time left, another point that you've emphasized is the way in which this effort and intelligence in support of Russia's war against Ukraine, which you're precisely right, has been an alliance effort, and that the alliance intelligence cooperation has been an important part of that story. So I'd be interested, both for you and for the chairman, to say something about how does this, what's the big, this is not just an American story, this is a NATO story, and it's an alliance story.
It is, and as I said before, I think the intelligence sharing that we engage in, and it's a two-way street. We learn a lot from our NATO partners. We learn a lot from the Ukrainians as well. I think has been the kind of essential cement in the coalition that the president has organized as well. And that's a constant day-by-day challenge to be able to work as hard as we can across the U.S. intelligence community with General Cavoli and our partners at SACURIT in Europe to make sure that we have the clearest picture possible across the alliance. And we put a very high premium, we always have done this, but especially now during this war, on sharing in a very quick and systematic way.
And does your committee get involved with the analogs in, let's say, France or Britain or Germany?
Well, we certainly do on the information sharing and the intelligence sharing, but I just want to give, as we're ending, Director Burns credit for the fact that we had sort of taken our eye off the ball with respect to Russia. We had sort of moved on, and we didn't have as much resources directed toward Russia as the Ukraine issue was unfolding. And Director Burns, along with the Department of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence, had to really pull together, including our allies, new information and new critical analytical scrutiny of what we could find. And Director Burns led that, and certainly with great success.
Well, unfortunately, we've come to the witching hour. I would say, as a citizen, I'm extremely proud of the intelligence community and its performance, and of the prospects for it under a chairman who's determined to make this supportive relationship. So I think for all of us who are concerned about the threats in the world, and particularly about Putin's war against Ukraine, we're very glad to have such good folks protecting us. Thank you very much.